island that you can see out here. And it was the first unit of what would become the system. And part of what made this unit unusual is it became a sanctuary for migratory birds. But it took till 1929, and I believe it was an 8-year process for migratory birds, the Migratory Bird Act, Conservation Act, to be passed. And I'm showing this world map because later on in some slides in advance, you'll see the extent of the national wildlife system, which is really quite surprising in its impact in the world. But this is the world flyways. And here is a more familiar one for us, at least in our continental flyway area. And you can see that we live in a fairly busy area that's important for migratory birds. But moving forward, in 1939, President Roosevelt appointed a committee on wildlife restoration, and, pardon me, in 1939, and some of the names will be familiar to you, although the chairman was Thomas H. Beck, which we're not as familiar with. Ding Darling and Aldo Leopold and Beck were asked to prepare a report for the Secretary of Agriculture for an aggressive program to acquire lands for waterfowl, mammals, songbirds, insect-eating birds, ornamental birds, which is an interesting term. And this is the first time it was recommended that funds be earmarked for acquisition and habitat restoration. Now, they did produce something out of this that helped start funding that, and that was the federal duck stamp, which these funds went to support this program for migratory birds. Now, moving well forward, it did take till 1940 for U.S. Fish and Wildlife, based on that commission and their report, to be formed. But funding was still an issue. And in 1969, Lyndon Johnson and Congress passed the Land and Water Conservation Act, and that fund has been the basis for funding national wildlife refuges. And I have to point out, when you go to look for a picture of offshore drilling, which the funds come from, it comes from the royalties on offshore drilling, and half of that money is supposed to go towards funding different Department of Interior holdings. And it has only been 2 years since then that it actually was half of the funding. The rest of the time it would be swept. And I have to point out that I'm looking for offshore drilling to put in this picture. All of the offshore drilling pictures from the gas and oil companies are very romantic, okay? So in 1973, Richard Nixon signed the Endangered Species Act, and he put the Fish and Wildlife Service in charge of enforcing that act, and again enforced the focus of what national wildlife refuges were about. Moving forward quickly, in 2009, you can see that brown pelicans were taken off of the endangered species list, based way back in 1903 on Theodore Roosevelt's first action to protect brown pelicans who were on the edge of extinction. And now we see brown pelicans in many, many places, and in surprising places. So they were removed. You can see the action that it took well over 100 years to happen, but it happened. And this has just recently happened, and I'll end with this. If you want to see the full scope of what the refuge system has been built on over the last 120 years, you can go to the National Wildlife Refuge site under Fish and Wildlife, and they have a great timeline of how everything happened, how U.S. Fish and Wildlife was formed. But this goes back to that picture of the offshore drilling. in a rare bipartisan movement, all our levels of government passed the Great American Outdoors Act, which establishes that the earmark is supposed to go to the national park units and to U.S. Fish and Wildlife holdings in the national park and the wildlife refuge system. So this was just passed. This was called by the conservation writer from the Harvard Gazette the biggest land conservation legislation in a generation. So we're hoping to see good things come from this. And from this recently, we just signed in August. So many of you probably heard about it. The mission of the Fish and Wildlife, as stated on their site, is to administer a national network of land and waters for conservation and management and restoration of fish, wildlife, plant resources, and their habitats within the United States. And the National Wildlife Refuge System was formally established in 1966. Now, here's one of the reasons why I wanted to show you the flyways nationally, because it's quite surprising where national wildlife refuges are around the Pacific and continental America. And it's a wide range and has big impacts. And the system today includes 568 wildlife refuges, 38 wetland management, and it covers 95 million acres of land. And you can explore, this is right off the website, you can explore any of these by simply clicking on it and then going to the refuge system on the National Wildlife Refuge site. So it's very interesting. You can get lost in it and you can skate around in it for a long time. Now going back to that boardwalk off of Pelican Island, you can see, I think it ends at 1936 here, but Hackmatack National Wildlife in Illinois and Wisconsin, a bi-state refuge, was added in 2012. And here is the ceremonial, placing of the, or here's the actual placing of our plank for Hackmatack National Wildlife in January. Our current president is second from the bottom on the right. Margaret got to go to that. Later on, I brought my mother, who I think is the most important visitor there, to our Hackmatack plank when we visited Florida. So if you go to Pelican Island, you can walk the boardwalk and see all of the wildlife refuges. And it's getting to be a very impressive boardwalk. So
you keep going.
Oh, I am going. So Hackmatack National Wildlife Refuge is a bi-state refuge. It is in the Fox River watershed. You can see the Nippersink Creek watershed where it straddles. Obviously, I think most of our FREPsters know that the watershed for Fox River goes from Waukesha, Wisconsin to Ottawa, Illinois. And there's 202 square miles in Nippersink. And we are embedded in the Nippersink watershed and based on the resources in the Fox watershed and in the Nippersink watershed. Here is our Friends of Hackmatack Steering Committee. Before we were an official Friends group, we called ourselves Friends of Hackmatack. And this is a picture taken for the first site that was bought. It was a mere approximately 12 acres of wetland. It was quite a feat to get this done and get it done on November 12, 2012. Took a lot of help from partners, but it was bought. And this is our basic steering committee. That was Margaret in the yellow was our current president. She was from Wisconsin. There were people from Wisconsin and Illinois who came together who had never met each other before, and we became fast friends and spent years dreaming and working and looking at what we needed to do to make this refuge a dream. Okay, now Steve is going to take over now.
Hello, I'm going to take you back about 15 years. This was well before the refuge was established, and we became aware as we dreamed about a refuge that we needed to do several things. We needed to build the biological case for the refuge and take that the show on the road and begin to garner public support. So I'm going to walk you through some of that process. It's interesting when you try and condense about 8 years of effort into about 40 slides, but I'm going to give it a go here. The first thing, as we began to gather information, information available through the McHenry County Conservation District was incredibly important. They have a database with 400,000 pieces of information on 57 different sites in McHenry County. We also relied upon information available through the Illinois Natural Areas Inventory. And most people, quite frankly, are surprised at the concentration of high quality natural areas that still survive within the Chicagoland region, and more specifically within the Northeastern Morainal Division of Illinois. As we began to put together the case for the refuge, we wanted to show how establishment of a refuge would begin to support several different planning documents, one of which was the Illinois Wildlife Action Plan. Some of the communities that occur, the natural plant communities that occur within the proposed refuge are listed on the left. And you can see some of those are considered either critically imperiled globally or imperiled globally. So these are very rare communities that are certainly worthy of our efforts to protect. And I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about some of those. The forests from the Illinois Wildlife Action Plan had several recommendations to restore 15 to 20 sites, at least 200 acres in size, and then also to begin to restore the existing woodland communities. And we know that these woodland communities are important for a variety of habitat restricted wildlife species, including featured here, the red-headed woodpecker. And we know from some of the groundbreaking work that Ed Collins and the McHenry County Conservation District conducted is that, quite frankly, we've lost a lot of our oak woodlands. And in fact, only about 13% of our oak woodlands currently survive in McHenry County. And that same trend is mirrored across the Chicagoland region. With regard to prairies, some of the goals from the Wildlife Action Plan to restore sites that are at least 500 acres in size, and again, to manage those existing grasslands. And we know that larger grasslands are important for a whole suite of wildlife species, including the bobolink, grassland birds. We know that populations of bobolinks have declined in Illinois over the last several decades. And putting together a refuge that would protect large blocks of habitat was certainly something that we promoted as we built the biological case for the refuge. Similarly, with regard to wetlands, critically important habitats, again, from the Wildlife Action Plan, the goal was to establish wetland communities of at least 1,000 acres in size. And we know that these wetlands support an incredible variety and diversity of plants and animals, many of which are considered endangered or threatened by the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. Similarly, with regard to the creek system, Nancy has previously mentioned that the Nippersink really is the armature or framework upon which the refuge has been built. But This Nipissing Creek provides a high quality aquatic resource, and certainly protecting that and managing for that is compatible with provisions of the Illinois Wildlife Action Plan. One of the species that survives within the watershed, I don't know if you can pick it out on the screen there, it's the mottled sculpin, but let me help you. There it is right there. And this particular species is dependent upon silt-free riffling habitat, particularly those aquatic systems that are associated with some of our upper reaches of streams. We similarly looked at the Wildlife Action Plan, and I don't want you to look at that entire screen. I've kind of summarized and captured here for you some of the elements of the Wildlife Action Plan prepared for Wisconsin that would be supported by a refuge. Restore oak woodlands, savannas, link those habitats together, restore tamarack swamps, manage wetlands, restore riparian habitats, and increase public ownership for recreation and ecological function. So again, the establishment of a refuge would certainly support elements of the Wisconsin Wildlife Action Plan. We also looked at information available through the Wisconsin Breeding Bird Atlas and found that over 100 different species of birds are found within Walworth Township and County, and certainly a hotspot for birds in the southeastern portion of the state of Wisconsin. And we found that we needed to begin to work with Ducks Unlimited as one of the partners to entice them to be a partner in our efforts to restore and to acquire wetland communities. And the areas in darker shades of orange and red are those sites that that Ducks Unlimited themselves, through their Great Lakes hen model, determined were opportunities for supporting a number of waterfowl and wetland bird species. Many of you are familiar with the Chicago Wilderness Biodiversity Recovery Plan, and we worked with Chicago Wilderness and sought their endorsement for the refuge, and we were able to again demonstrate how establishment of a refuge would support several key elements of this plan and support the Green Infrastructure Plan, which is I guess a plan that captures greenways and connections, all of which are important in maintaining and sustaining the wildlife diversity and habitat diversity that's present within the Chicago region. We also looked at the Fish and Wildlife Service documents, and particularly this one, the 5-year action plan. And one of the key elements there that we felt that the refuge would support was an effort to promote habitat connectivity and integrity. And actually, as we worked with Brian Anderson, who was working with some of the landscape conservation initiatives, we began to look at how the Illinois Wildlife Action Plan and the Wisconsin Wildlife Action Plan fit together, and we found that actually the establishment of a refuge could very likely provide an important landscape linkage between the Kettle Moraine Complex in Wisconsin and portions of the Fox River watershed in Illinois. If you've ever looked at the Fish and Wildlife Service website, you'll find that there are lots of different planning documents, and one that, so we used some of those documents to show the Fish and Wildlife Service that establishment of a refuge would support several of their own conservation priorities. For example, of the 83 bird species identified in their conservation priority list for Region 3, it's likely that 51 of those species would nest in appropriate habitat in the proposed wildlife refuge. We also showed how the establishment of a refuge could play an important and pivotal role in sustaining the whooping crane, particularly as it migrates from some of its more traditional nesting sites in central Wisconsin down to Florida. Nancy mentioned earlier, we didn't have the faintest idea of how to begin to establish a refuge. We knew that we needed to assemble information about the biological importance of the natural areas and open spaces in the bi-state region. And we needed to begin to tell the story, to share the dream. And in this picture, we're meeting on site. I think this is a site up in Wisconsin with Mark Miller, who was then the director of the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. And many of you recognize to his right, John Rogner, who is now the assistant director, again, for the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. As we began to share this dream, we realized that we needed to also build a compelling case with regard to the economic value that a refuge could bring to the region. And the Open Lands actually paid for a feasibility study that actually determined the economic value that a refuge could bring. But much of that economy and the economic value could be built upon the agricultural heritage of the region, the trail systems, the gateway communities, and again, of course, the recreational opportunities that would be associated with a refuge in the vicinity. We began to also share with our gateway communities what a national wildlife refuge could bring, and we pointed out some of the interesting facts about refuge-oriented tourism. Local economies could clearly benefit, and in the Chicago region, it's estimated that the birding community alone generates $350 million per year for local communities. And the Fermata study that was commissioned by Open Lands estimated that there could be as many as 200,000 visitors to the refuge, and that those visitors could spend anywhere from $7 to $25 million annually. Now this assumes, of course, that there's a visitor center and the refuge is built out. But we wanted to share the potential that a refuge could bring to these gateway communities, particularly Richmond, Genoa City, some of the smaller communities. And of course, the bike trail system currently is well used and serves to connect people with the natural world around them. We also showed how the refuge would support the Wisconsin statewide outdoor recreational plan. This plan describes the benefits associated with open spaces, particularly for individuals that are tied to an urban community. And for this proposed refuge, we repeatedly pointed out that the refuge could serve close to 12 million people in Rockford, Madison, Milwaukee, and of course, Chicago. And the chapter 5 in this particular document calls for expanding partnerships to conserve and restore large landscapes. And then, of course, we really embraced an element of the Fish and Wildlife Service, the urban refuge policy, which is to acquire lands and waters that will develop and inform and involve citizenry that will support fish and wildlife conservation. And as we worked with the Fish and Wildlife, they had frequently boasted that there was a refuge within easy driving distance, within close distance of every major metropolitan city in the nation. And we pointed out that we were missing out in the Chicago region. And I think, quite frankly, Tom Larson and some of the people that we worked with got a little tired of this, but we used it as a message to hammer home that, that we needed a refuge in the Chicago region. And here, of course, clearly, we were lacking a refuge. As we worked with the local communities, we began to garner their support. And this is an opinion piece from the Woodstock Independent from 2011, where in their view, Hackmatack is a good fit for the region. And here is a call for action where we were garnering support for 4 public hearings that were held by the service, which is required as part of their planning and establishment of a refuge. And there were over 400 attendees in 2 public meetings in Illinois. And the Fish and Wildlife Service was quite frankly amazed at the overwhelming level of support for the refuge. So in August of 2012, Secretary of Interior Ken Salazar and Senator Dick Durbin were on hand then to announce establishment of Hackmatack National Wildlife Refuge. Quite an occasion. Ed Collins had an opportunity to hobnob with the senator and secretary. And as previously has been announced, the refuge was formally established on November 6th of 2012. Now I need to point out some elements of this map. The areas in brown are the core areas that were established by the Fish and Wildlife Service. They build upon the light areas in green, and the light areas in green are properties already owned by largely the McHenry County Conservation District, and to the north of the state line, the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. And these core areas will provide the necessary habitat for some of those rare grassland bird species, other wildlife species that have habitat and size restrictions. The lighter brown areas are cores that largely lie along the north branch and the south branch of the Nippersing Creek. And in these areas, easements could be used to protect land. There would be greater flexibility with regard to recreational uses. But this really is the refuge outline and boundary. The important thing is that it does provide for protection of over 11,000 acres of land. And we refer to it as our donut, but really it's a core and corridor concept where large core habitats are established with connecting corridors. I've kind of touched on this. The core areas will protect large blocks of grasslands, oak, savanna, and wetland. And the linking corridors are largely built around the riparian corridors and also provide opportunities for restoring wetlands and grasslands. The important thing here too is that we always impress upon folks that the Fish and Wildlife Service works with willing landowners and sellers. That's an important theme and important message that we frequently highlight. The refuge goals here are threefold: provide habitat for wetland and grassland bird species. And some of the information that has been established here show that there would be a significant increase in the numbers of henslow sparrows as well as dickcissels if the refuge is built out. And similarly for some of the wetland bird species, an estimated 41 breeding bird species would increase dramatically, as well as the state threatened least bittern. So we've used this kind of information to show how building out the refuge, restoring habitats will have significant impact upon grassland and wetland bird species. Refuge, the second goal of the refuge, provide opportunities for hunting, fishing, and other types of outdoor recreational opportunities. The third refuge goal is to promote science, education, research, and I think probably most important here, responsible stewardship of our natural resources. The refuge has hired, the Fish and Wildlife Service has hired a refuge manager. The Friends Group is now a 501c3 organization recognized by the Internal Revenue Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and a little over 1,400 acres of land has now been protected. And Nancy will talk more about how we're reaching out to local communities. The Friends Group remains a very much hands-on group. Here pictured with several bags of garlic mustard at the Turner parcel in Wisconsin. One of the most successful aspects of I think of our efforts to date has been to establish a partnership. You can see them there, partners that have all agreed to work together to acquire and manage lands that are part of the refuge system. There are now 11 partners that are working together to do so. And with regard to land protection updates, I've got one last slide here. You can see the familiar donut-shaped outline of the refuge. The Peterson property in the lower left-hand portion in one of our core areas, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service accepted a 12-acre conservation easement on November 6th. And that's critically important because when the Fish and Wildlife Service accepted either an easement or fee title property, the refuge was officially established. So that really was an important part of the establishment of the refuge. I'm going to show you also the Turner parcel, the Paracone parcel, and the Blackman parcel. These are parcels that have been acquired that have now been conveyed to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And now I'm going to very quickly run through just to give you an idea of the scope of effort that has taken place since the refuge was established. Hoffman Farm, I'm not going to read these, but I'm just going to point out all the different arrows and the different parcels of land that have been protected through the efforts of that partnership. And particularly, I want to acknowledge Open Land that has worked with Illinois Clean Energy to accept funds that in turn are used to acquire lands in the footprint or near the refuge itself. So that's a pretty remarkable success story to date, and we want to, as we look forward to the future, build upon that effort. Here, the Turner parcel, partners included Open Lands, Ducks Unlimited. It's been conveyed to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in 2018. Remnants of an oak savanna on the Shade parcel, Nipperson Creek on the Paracone parcel. Just to give you a quick look at some of the different properties to date. And I'm going to turn it over to Nancy, and we also want to give Todd an opportunity to talk if Todd's still on.
Okay, so one of the important parts of Fish and Wildlife's focus, particularly their urban refuge focus, is the importance of communicating the work they do to the general public. Frequently these refuges are far away, and you know, you don't always get an opportunity to visit some of them. And so Hackmatack has taken it upon themselves, Friends of Hackmatack, to make sure that our local public is understanding the initiatives of Fish and Wildlife. And so National Wildlife Refuge Week is one of the things that we collaborate with Fish and Wildlife and all our land protection partners with. We have our quarterly Friends gatherings. They are sometimes programs. They are sometimes a walk in areas that are protected or in areas that will be like what Hackmatack is as it gets built out into the future. We also have our annual meeting, and this year I want to point out to everybody we're having a Zoom meeting. This was from a few years back where we had Dr. Richard Bilfos, who is the International Crane Foundation Executive Director. But this November 10th, we will be focusing our annual meeting on the importance of diversity in conservation. And we will have Suzanne Trapp from U.S. Fish and Wildlife talking, along with two very articulate young ladies who are Hispanic and have gone into conservation work, and they will discuss their journey about that. So we will be posting this on our website, and we'll have our website there. But basically, if you Google Friends of Hackmatack, you will hit our website. And thank you, Becky, for getting us updated in the new format. We're working on that. Okay, and then we have something called Restoration Workdays, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with. It's been a challenge this year. We had to shut down and then reopen, and we're doing it all socially distanced. But we have Restoration Workdays on multiple types of properties within the Hackmatack footprint, and we rely heavily on volunteers to help with those restoration days. Here's obviously brush cutting work day. I think this might have been the Keebler property. And here is one on a new property that Open Lands is working on that will be turned over. This was early before COVID, so people are not socially distanced here, so don't ding us for that. This is before that. But we began working on some of these sites. We also worked with Conservation District and U.S. Fish and Wildlife and Youth Conservation Corps promotion, and these are some young late high school age kids who actually worked for the summer. And I love the guy with the snake around his neck. We were debating on what kind of snake that was. But we had some amazing work done by them where they worked on all aspects of restoration and biological discovery, quite frankly. So we're hoping that program will be continued. We did that for several years in conjunction with the Conservation District and U.S. Fish and Wildlife. International Migratory Bird Day is a day that we celebrate. Obviously, you went from our earlier slides, you see this is a big focus of Fish and Wildlife. And we do that with multiple friends in the area, including our DNR presence here in McHenry County and Sierra Club and Audubon and Friends of Bolo Bog and the Conservation District and Fish and Wildlife. And down below, we actually have Fish and Wildlife employees who come and band birds. We hope to get back to that practice, but it's an amazing thing to watch children be able to see the birds so closely. It's a very popular event. And then we have Monarch Mania Family Fun Fair, which much to our surprise turned out to be a huge success. We started this, I believe we would have had our 6th fun fair this August, based on the focus that Fish and Wildlife have for monarch conservation. And we hold it at Crystal Lake Main Beach, and have had a focus of holding it there because that is on Sundays in August or in the summertime. You find many of the local Hispanic families holding an all-day picnic there, and they spend the day at the beach. And then many of our members from people from all over Crystal Lake and other areas come to the beach. So we held this, and we had, much to our surprise, in 3 hours over, I think the first one we had like 500 people through there. And we have a huge coalition that puts this on and has booths. And this is just some of the members of the Monarch Coalition. When that says Monarch Committee, we decided to call ourselves Coalition. It is pretty much a self-running show now. It was difficult to put together, and we have true believers in the Park District and U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Actually, one of the partners should be the local Culvers provides free ice cream chips for us, for everybody who comes through and does our little quiz to learn about monarchs. Like, for instance, how do monarchs taste their food? And so they have to go to the different booths and answer this. We have face painting. It is quite an interesting group that works with this. So hopefully we'll be back to that next August, we shall see, but we're still working on the Monarch Initiative. Sierra Club, we can fully thank them for bringing the concept of teaching, children, and particularly children from urban areas that do not get to come out, teaching them about conservation and about working in the natural world. And these particular kids are from the Pritzker College Prep School, and all of these other partners work together to give them a weekend. They came out where they learned a lot about restoration. It's interesting because many of the children who came out, or the young adults who came out, had not experienced doing this kind of work before. And we put them through our paces, and Sierra Club puts them through their paces. We do stream monitoring and restoration and seed collection. We do the hard work of cutting with them. And then they have programs and information woven through the day about all of this. And we had a great friend in Clearwater Outdoors in Lake Geneva who put them on paddle boards, canoes, and other types of watercraft, kayak, where many of them had never had to experience that. And I'll have to say, one day I was out there helping with that, and when they had them on the paddle boards, and it was a cold day, and every one of those kids tipped each other over to go in the water, and they loved it. So it was really quite amazing how quickly they took to everything and learned how to do it. The big sit we just held, it's National Wildlife Refuge Week, and that's when it's held. And we had a lot of visitors, but basically the idea behind it is that you supposedly stick to a certain area, and every bird that you see from that area, you record. We recorded as many as 58 birds all day long. We get a lot of migrants. We're in an area where we overlook a huge wetland, and we will continue this. It's held on a Sunday, and it goes from sunup to sundown. And then In Search of Eagles is something we do in the dead of winter. This is not as cold a day, obviously. We've had some very cold days, but we do them in the areas near the dams on the Fox River, starting with the Carpentersville Dam up above Dundee, and all the way up into Fontana. And this little boy we have a big circle. This is how big the eagle's nest was at this particular site. And then we had some leftover branches of things that had been cut down, and the boy built the nest and then insisted on having his his little baby brother come into the nest, and so he's doing nests to look like an eagle. So then we have a program afterwards where we have actual raptors and a center that brings the raptors. This year we will have to do that virtually, but we will still hold that early morning, starting I believe at about 8:30 this year at the dam sites. If you want to come, we very frequently see eagles now, which is amazing from what it was 20 years ago. And then I want to point out that we do active restoration. Friends of Hackmatack works actively to get grants to do restoration on the site. And right now we are working on our second Illinois Clean Energy Community Foundation Stewardship Challenge grant, with the hopes to raise some $30,000 in order to do restoration on a property we call Tamarack South, is that
East
correct?
parcel.
East, the east parcel, and that is right near Richmond High School. So if anybody wants to come and help with a work day, we distance people and break them up into groups. You know, we'd love to have you, because Illinois Clean Energy will match our 400 volunteer work hours once we get to it with a $4,000 match. But we also have to raise $7,000 in hard cash in donations, and they will give us a 3-to-1 match on that. We are now at about halfway there, at about $3,500 or $3,500. And we do this on our website with these silly puzzles, and each little square is $10. So if you are so inclined and have some funds you want to see matched 3-to-1, please go to our website. You can click on the Stewardship Challenge button and go to the site and buy yourself a piece of the puzzle. Maybe you can buy the wood duck's eyeball, okay? So that's our shameful promotion there. But it's for conservation. And I'll have to say that this whole journey started with a crazy group of us who sat down and went, hey, where's our, wildlife refuge? As Ed Collins said, we're not the majesty of the mountains, but we do have the diversity here, and the quiet beauty of the streams and the prairies and the wetlands that could be. And so this became kind of our, as we sat there many cold nights meeting, trying to understand how to make this happen, trying to build our supporters. And we had everybody from a small ice cream store up in Hebron who was so excited about it, they developed Hackmatack ice cream, to Dick Durbin. We went from all local businesses and county boards and DNRs and all the different groups we could go to garner it. And we garnered quite a bit of support, which was a surprise to Fish and Wildlife. We thought that's what you had to do. And it worked for us. And I think they found us, Fish and Wildlife found us sometimes fairly humorous and interesting. So here's our, you can find us on Facebook. We put all our activities on Facebook. And Becky Hogue, a website extraordinary developer, is just revamping our website. So pardon any partially done things, but you can just find us at hackmatacknwr.org. And I would like right now, if you could, Todd, maybe you could say a few words. And I will stop sharing unless anybody wants me to leave this on a little longer, but you can just Google Friends of Hackmatack and find us, okay?
Describe what Hackmatack is.
Oh, yeah, we should do that.
I can say a few words. So this is Todd Boonstra. I'm actually the refuge manager that they refer to in the presentation. And thanks, Steve and Nancy, for an excellent presentation in the refuge. I think you do such a great job at that to promote the refuge. And I would I would actually say take it one step further, in that you can see that there's a lot of work going on with the refuge. There's a lot of things to do, and a lot of it is due to Nancy and Steve and the Friends group and getting a lot of this work done to make this available for everyone to participate in. So I can't thank them enough for this. We are a relatively new refuge. From the refuge service standpoint, 2012 is what we consider a relatively new refuge. And I actually think that this is a great stepping stone. There's a huge amount of public support. And I actually think that we're only going to get bigger, in the sense that the more opportunities there are, the more the people will start, the public will start to know about it. And Nancy and Steve can officially never retire from this, because I will depend on them to do with this. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay, Steve wanted to mention, why don't you go ahead and describe it? We never described why it was named Hackmatack and what it means, and we probably should do that.
I know you're all on mute, but I would like to have you at least say for yourself and repeat after me. Hackmatack, kind of rhymed with Big Mac attack, but everybody say it. Hackmatack.
Attack.
Okay. So I trust that you you got it out, but we did want to share that that Hackmatack is a catchy phrase, but it's actually an Algonquin Indian word for tamarack tree. And tamarack still survive within the footprint of the refuge, and we hope to see more tamarack wetlands in the future as we continue to acquire and restore wetland basins within the footprint of the refuge. So that's a little bit about the origins of the name for the refuge.
Thank you, Nancy and Steve and Todd. If anyone has any questions, you can either unmute yourself and ask that, or probably a little more efficient to type them into the chat box, and I will try to relay those to Nancy and Steve. So if there's any questions any of you have, it is quite a story, and as they said, a multi-year journey to the establishment of this refuge and all the success that it's seen there. As a lot of you know, I used to work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and so I was there when a lot of this stuff was going on. I wasn't directly involved. I took care of all the other stuff while John focused on things like this refuge, but it's really a very good story. So, all right, there is a question here. Can any additional qualifying lands be rolled into the wildlife refuge over time?
Todd, you want to handle that one?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, there's many different avenues in which land can be enrolled into the refuge system. Donation is one avenue, all the way down to acquisition. We can actually do and can acquire properties from willing landowners to be included in the refuge. So yes, lands can be rolled into the refuge system, and into this refuge in particular.
But those are properties that exist within the current footprint of the refuge. How about a piece of property located just outside the boundary of the refuge itself?
Yeah, so as Steve indicated, that donut-shaped map was the approved acquisition boundary for the refuge. So if a property happens to fall outside that boundary, we would actually look to our conservation partners to see if that is something that they could acquire or would have an interest in to help the footprint of the refuge, because my limitations are limited to that boundary. And I would look to other partners to go beyond that boundary.
And of course, that was one of the concepts all along, was that this would be done through partnerships, through easements, through all kinds of maybe non-traditional mechanisms, not just land acquisition by the Fish and Wildlife Service.
You know, we visited Minnesota Valley National Wildlife Refuge, and when I first looked at the refuge map, it had holes, you know, and then I talked to the refuge manager there, and he said, well, there are other lands that are part of our footprint, But for instance, this one is a business that has a large holding right adjacent to us. And we work with them to manage their open space lands. And I believe they were having them hayed. He said we work with them to manage that they hay after nesting season. So there's all sorts of ways to put it together. There were other properties that were owned by Minnesota DNR and other properties that were owned that were actually county parks and things like that. So that's kind of the concept that we went with, because we understood we already have protected lands. We already have a lot of organizations working in the area that do easements or other things. And so we would do that same kind of quilting together.
Right. Yep. So another question that was posted is, what are some of the research needs, especially related to the restoration in the corridor, in the connecting corridors?
That's a good question. Researching.
Seems like that's a question for you, Steve. What are the research needs?
Well, I think probably as important as research is monitoring. And I think it's important to, and actually we benefit a lot from Dave Miller, a volunteer with the McHenry County Conservation District. He does a lot of work monitoring bird populations, particularly wetland birds in a number of the wetland basins that give us an idea of what kinds of birds are out there. So I would say that probably expanded monitoring will be important, and also to build upon the monitoring to document, and which will require research, but certainly field time documenting the response of our woodland communities to restoration, to document the success of some of our prairie restorations. Currently we're working with, Todd is working with Pheasants Forever to secure prairie seed for hundreds of acres of land that's currently in cropland that will be retired and restored to prairie. So I think there will be a need to continue to document what works well, what doesn't work, and build upon some of the successes of some of the restoration work. So that's how I would respond to that right now.
Yeah, and I would actually take it even one step further in thinking more of the research aspect. There's always a need for additional research to come up with new conservation methods. And especially in the corridor areas where it's more of a heavier ag community, is how are we able to keep this as a working lands type landscape, but making sure conservation is coming forward. And if there's a new method to do that, I think that's definitely a research need to come up with that method to help get more conservation on the ground to meet the needs of more people in that corridor areas.
So maybe your program next month, Jeff, with regenerative farming would be helpful.
Absolutely, and part of that, we know that farmers themselves really aren't in our target audience as FREP, but we're targeting other organizations that own lands where they're still putting it under a farm lease program or what have you, and where they might want to learn a little bit more about it. So that's where we have Brad Woodson's going to speak about what the Conservation District is currently doing in that regard and what they'd like to do. You know, and then Joe will give some statewide perspective, and Olga's going to talk about some of the monitoring and the information that we need to collect to sort of bolster the case for regenerative agriculture. And you know, a place like the Refuge would be a perfect place to be using those practices and to be learning more from it. Any other questions or comments that folks have?
I have a question, but I can't get it. I don't know how to get it to work on my computer.
Go ahead.
So if I have not been there, which I haven't really, where would they recommend going and parking and walking and
That's a
checking
good
out the
question.
place?
Yep, no, that's a good question.
Well,
How do you visit?
So I guess if you're looking at just the refuge parcels that the Fish and Wildlife owns, The Turner parcel does have a parking lot there. If you go to our website, there typically is a map that's located, shows you it's right off of Highway H, just northwest of Genoa City. There's a parking lot with a kiosk there. The other parcel that would be open and available to go to is Paracone and Shade property, which is right off of Thayer Road in 47. There's a parking lot in the kiosk there also, right off of Highway 47. Then there's the third parcel, which is the Blackman parcel, which if you've been on the Prairie Trail coming out of Richmond heading south, you've gone through the Blackman parcel. It's one of the few parcels where there is no vehicle access. Essentially, it's a hiking trail access for people to just stop at the picnic tables to take a break while you're on the trail. It is one that just transferred to us this summer. But I guess I can take a broader look at it as part of the Hackmatack footprint. If part of that boundary, it could also be Glacial Park. Glacial Park is considered part of that shape. So it could be other agencies and where they offer too. So there's a lot of opportunity within the refuge footprint too.
Okay, thanks.
Bill, is there any measure?
Yeah, okay, I see another question here. Are there measures for determining how much land needs to be in conservation in order to sustain the biodiversity at the refuge? And I know that's a loaded question, depends on which organisms you're talking about. It's just like corridors. What's an adequate corridor? It depends on the species, the guild, whatever that you're talking about using it.
Yeah, I think you just answered the best. It really depends on the species. From a refuge standpoint, the footprint that they determined was a size in which they determined could meet the needs of most species. Obviously, with the grassland species, they're looking for a higher acreage, higher chunks of blocks of land in order to make it more contiguous. All the way down to, if you look at the Nippersink corridor, it could be just a buffer strip is all you need. So it was kind of a compromise. Instead of trying to enclose the entire northeastern part and southeastern part of the footprint that they came up with, based on the studies that Steve and Nancy and everything alluded to, was the compromise in order to feel the footprint was large enough to meet the needs for the mission of the refuge.
And I would point out that this is a multi-generational effort. Since the refuge was established in 2012, that's now 8 years ago, or almost 8 years ago in November, we've been able to protect almost 1,500 acres. And the build out for the refuge provides for as much as 11,000, just over 11,000 acres of land. So it's going to be a multi-generational effort, and of course concentrating on some of these core areas to assemble large blocks of habitat will certainly be a priority as we move forward. Large blocks, we can begin to restore the hydrology. You can manage for large blocks of grasslands and different types of grassland habitat to support the entire suite of grassland bird species. So we're not there yet, but we've made some good progress, and it's going to be, as I mentioned before, a multi-generational effort. So Todd's grandchildren could be one of his grandchildren could be a refuge manager here.
There you go. So maybe one final question that I'll pose to Todd, Steve, and Nancy is, can you think of ways that FREP as an organization can support Hackmatack?
Well, I would say use your voice to continue to support and make people aware of the refuge, that it exists, that there are opportunities for people to support it, to become engaged with the Friends, with the Fish and Wildlife Service, to support some of our outreach activities, and to participate, if they so choose, in some of our hands-on restoration work days. And so that's my response. I'll turn it over to Nancy and Todd if they want to comment further.
Well, I think you have been supporting it. I know that there's a lot of cross-pollination on websites and information on the downstream. we probably need to be good about getting that information to you. We're primarily in the upper reaches. You know, maybe things like, you know, Eagle Days can be expanded with groups. And especially now this January, it'll be a Zoom meeting with Eagle presentation rather than in person. And maybe there are other areas where people would like to help people meet eagles early in the morning in January.
Yeah, and I will take a little bit broader approach as just a conservation partner. At this point, any conservation that gets out to the communities or the public is a good message to get out to them. So I think as just being a conservation-minded individuals, to getting that out to the community to show why that is important is just as supportive for the refuge as it is being right there working with us on the work days. It's just getting that word out there is important.
Right. All right, well, thank you.
Yeah, we are in the Fox River Ecosystem Partnership footprint.
That's right. That's right. And kind of the mutual members and all of that stuff. So thank you, Steve and Nancy, for a great presentation. Thank you, Todd, for being able to join us after you thought that you might not be able to today. I think it was a great program. A lot of positive comments in the chat box as well. So thank you very much. This recording or this presentation was recorded after the first couple of seconds when Carolyn reminded me to turn it on. And so this will be, a link to this will be posted to the FREP webpage, and we can share that with the friends as well, so that folks that weren't able to be on it live right now can watch the recording of it later. Since we're doing most of our presentations virtually, we're trying to make that available, and we're even thinking about when we go back to live in-person presentations, maybe we need to start figuring out ways to record all of those too, because a lot of people can't do it in the day, but they might want to sit and watch it in the evening. And it did remind me that if you're not connected, Open Lands, they were obviously a key partner in establishment of the refuge, and they're doing their annual banquet this week, but they're doing it virtually with video presentations on 3 days, where you get a notice and a link at noon to watch. And they're very amazing, very inspirational videos. So if you get a chance, probably you can sign up to that through Open Lands webpage. I know that they put an offer out through Chicago Wilderness that we could all get into it for free. So it might be something that you would want to watch. Conservation on a much larger scale. Yesterday they honored Dr. Debbie Moskovitz at the Field Museum, and she's been responsible for protecting over 2 million acres in the Amazon Andes areas in Central America, or South America. So, you know, just a little inspiration for what we could strive for. So with that, I think we'll wrap it up. Please join us on November 11th for our Zoom presentation on regenerative agriculture in the Fox River watershed. Thanks all, and have a great day.